Hello again, it's Tony Wright, First Love Christian Church, or FLCC, and A.B. Wright Ministries. You know what it is, 90-day Bible study. This is day number 13. We're finishing up in Numbers 32nd chapter, 19th verse. We'll be going through Deuteronomy 7th chapter. Now, remember yesterday we read about the Israelites avenging their treatment by the Midianites, and then they divided the spoils among the people. Now, here they are now, putting things together and putting things in order so that they can go in and occupy Canaan. We also saw where the tribes of Reuben, Dan, and Manasseh, they approached Moses here in the text. And they wanted to stay on the east side of the Jordan. They said that this land was well suited for cattle. And boy, did they have lots of cattle. But Moses asked them if they thought it was going to be fair for them to stay there while their brothers go over into Canaan and fight while they were there behind. Well, these tribes told them that they would build protection for their wives and children, then go into Canaan, help them conquer the territory, and they were willing to stay there as long as it took for every tribe to get their inheritance. So Moses, he was cool with that. So they were in agreement, and he went out and he told Eleazar, Joshua, that they were to make sure that if they followed through, that they would be able to come back to their land here on the east side of the Jordan. Now, if they failed to follow through, though, then they would have to help be part of the land that was divided up for inheritance there in Canaan. Then Moses, here in this text, he went through the process of chronicling Israel's travels from the time they left Egypt. And boy, did you see that list. These dudes have some mileage on them. Every mile they traveled from the time they were initially at Kadesh was a mile assigned to them because of their own disobedience. And every person who was above the age of 20 when they first arrived there was gone, except for Moses, Caleb, and Joshua. Whoa, are you kidding me? Do you remember how many people that was when Moses took the census? For men over 20, it was 603,550 men. And that's just for men over 20. What about women over 20? Boy, that's a lot of people dead, gone from disobedience. And now there's this entirely different generation of people perched once again here on the edge of their inheritance. And Moses, he's trying to warn them not to mess up this time. Don't mess this thing up again. So he laid out their journey so that they could understand what the nation had gone through. And most of what they had gone through, like we said, was caused by their own disobedience. It was on them. That's how it works, ain't it? When we fail to listen to God, we go through a lot of things that we really didn't have to. Seems like we would figure that one out sooner or later. But we just have to try things. Let's get up on out of here. So God now tells Moses that they're going to go into Canaan and drive out all the current inhabitants and divide the land between them. And he told them that if any inhabitants, if they leave any of them behind, that those inhabitants would become a thorn for Israel. And God said furthermore that if they left any inhabitants, that he would do to Israel what he had planned to do to those inhabitants. Oh boy. Now, all the boundaries of Canaan, they were described, and Moses identified the individuals that were going to represent the tribes in the division of the land. Well, half of Manasseh's tribe was going to have land here on the east side of the Jordan, as well as Gad's tribe and Reuben's tribe. They were going to receive their land, their inheritance here on the east side of the Jordan. The other 9.5 tribes, they would divide up their inheritance from the promised land. Now, there was also, though, to be land given to the Levites. Remember, they weren't part of the census. So God said that they would have 48 cities, and the Levites were, though, to give 60 of those cities as cities of refuge. And these refuge cities were to be safe places for individuals that had unintentionally killed somebody. Hoo-wee! Then, as Deuteronomy opens, the people of Israel, they're camped on the plain just across the Jordan River from Canaan. All in this generation that saw all those many miracles when God broke the bonds of their slavery in Egypt, all are gone. victims of their unwillingness to trust the Lord. Now, here's a new generation that has grown to maturity during these 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And this new generation, which is held fast to the Lord, is poised and ready and eager to cross the Jordan River and challenge those entrenched powers over there in the Canaanites. Boy, wee. But this leader, Moses, you know, his piety and his commitment to God that he's demonstrated all this time, that Israel has come to trust, he's about to die. And it's going to be a new leader, Joshua, who's going to take the armies of the Lord and go into battle across that river. So Moses, he's aware of his personal destiny, and he assembles the people that he's led all this time. And they love to hear his words, so he was giving them those final words. And in these words that he captured in these pages in Deuteronomy, he summed up the central truths and basic principles that he's come to understand through his many years of that intimate relationship with the Lord. Now, speaking under the inspiration of God's Spirit, Moses, he rehearses the whole history of God's saving work for Israel. He explains the motives that lie behind God's choice of Israel and God's gift of the law. And he goes on to restate the earlier instructions that he had given for holy living. Now, you probably noticed that most of what Moses is saying has been said before. As a matter of fact, much of it's been said a few times. So why in the world does he need to say it again? Well, we know that Moses, he's talking to this new generation now of Israelites. The old generation, except for him, Caleb, Joshua, all perished in the wilderness. And this new generation, they need to hear this law again for themselves. You know how we do. I heard something about that one time, you know, or well, nobody told me. You know how it goes. And as you can see by what God is doing now, he is not having any foolishness right about now. And since we tend to have such short memories, and these people were under 20 years old when the nation fell decades before at Kadesh Barnea, well, they needed to know God's word afresh. And they needed to realize how important it is to obey God. Whew, but it ain't nothing like fresh word, is it? Now, the nation, they're facing this new challenge. Remember, before now, Israel had been an unsettled nation, and they were just a mass of pilgrims passing through. Well, now, Israel was about to enter their own promised land, and they were going to become a settled nation. They were going to have to do battle, and they needed to be prepared. Now, you might have heard somebody say, if you can understand your past, you can chart a better future, you know, and avoid some of the obstacles, you know. Well, these people, they were going to do this battle, taking their promised land with a new leader, because Moses was checking out. And Joshua, since he was getting ready to take on this new leadership role for the nation, these people needed to hear from Moses. Now, having watched these Israelites, I'm sure you figured out that their success really depended on them obeying God. And by the way, regardless of who the human leader might be, if we can just stay grounded in the word and love the Lord with all our heart, boy, I'm about to get started. Anyway, if they did this and followed Joshua's leadership, as Joshua followed God's leadership, victory would indeed be there. Now, to be sure, they were going to be facing challenges and temptations that they had never had before. Now, that shouldn't be too difficult thing for us to understand, because the things you face are different when you're dealing with your own stuff. You know, it's different if it's somebody else's car, or if it's somebody else's house, or if it's somebody else's property. It just doesn't raise the same alarms when things get messed up. I'm just saying. And Moses wanted them to not only possess the land, but he also wanted them to maintain that possession. So he was warning them of the dangers that they were going to face, and he gave them the way to success. What? Here I go again. Whew. Okay. Somebody right now is where Israel was. They're standing outside of the promise. You standing right there outside of your promise. And you need a fresh word so you can go and get your promise. Boy, in giving them these words in Deuteronomy, though, Moses was sharing a word that was intended for everyone. As things were expounded, especially back in Numbers and Leviticus, quite a bit of what was said was provided kind of tilted toward the priests and the Levites, a little technical. But even though this book, Deuteronomy, repeats many of the laws that were found in the previous books and many of the statutes and things that we found there, it gives a new and deeper meaning to those laws, and it shows what they meant in the everyday lives of the people. Now, all of us today can learn a lot from Deuteronomy about the need for loving God and obeying his will. As this book points out, if we love God, then we will obey his word. We'll obey him. And if we obey God, he will bless us. So in these chapters, we saw that Moses reminded the people of God's guidance. Now, the nation was gathered here in the plains of Moab on this side of the Jordan. And this journey that had taken them 40 years, when you read there in verse 2, it looks like the journey should have really taken about 11 days. So this shows you what disobedience and unbelief can do. It's just a waste of our time. It's a waste of our energy. It's a waste of our resources, all this disobedience and disbelief. But the most important lesson is that disobedience and disbelief, it robs God of his glory. It delays others from getting to know his power and his might and his glory in the right season. Oh, they're gonna see those things. You just may not be around to see them. You know what I mean? Like Aaron and Moses. Anyway, Moses reminded them that Israel had camped at Mount Oreb for almost a year after their exodus from Egypt. And in that year, Moses had received the law and the tabernacle had been erected. Now, this new generation certainly should know why the nation was organized as it was, right? And why the nation had not entered its inheritance sooner. But Moses makes it clear that their sin at Kadesh Barnea was rebellion due to the nation's unbelief. Now, did you notice in your reading that there were 3 nations that Israel had to avoid? Remember Edom, the descendants of Esau, Jacob's brother, and Moab and Ammon, the descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew? Well, God did not permit Israel to fight these nations because they were blood relatives of Israel. God protected Israel as they passed through the borders of these great nations, though. Now, there was also 2 reasons why God allowed Israel to fight and conquer these other nations. Number 1, he wanted it to serve as a warning to those nations in Canaan. And secondly, he wanted to make that land available on this side of the Jordan. He wanted to make that available to those tribes that was going to settle on this side of the Jordan. Now, Israel was kind to those nations initially. They just wanted to pass through peaceably. But when those nations instead attacked Israel, then God conquered them. And he had guided and protected Israel in the past, and certainly he was going to be with them in the future. So Moses wanted to remind them. Then Moses reminds them of when the nation was back at Sinai, where God's glory and greatness was revealed, and where the nation trembled. Oh boy, were they shaking. They were shaking like a cat in a dog pound, let me tell you. But Moses didn't want these people to forget about that glory and greatness of God. So he warned them about a few things that they needed to make sure that they weren't guilty of doing. They couldn't forget God's word, because if they obeyed God's word, he would bless them and they would possess the land. But if they changed his word or disobeyed it, he would chasten them. And boy, it was not going to be good. They would lose the inheritance of their land. Now, when the children of God at any time let God's word become commonplace and they no longer respect it, then you can believe they are headed for some serious trouble. They also couldn't turn to idols. Moses reminded the people that they had seen no image of God even back at Sinai. but he warned them that they must not make any images. God proved himself greater than all the gods of Egypt. So why even bother to worship those idol gods? Moses, he summarized, though, the future of Israel. And we'll see this as we go through the word. They're going to turn to idols. They're going to be cast out of their land and scattered. They're going to serve other gods in captivity. And it's going to finally be in captivity where they're going to learn the lesson and abandon those false gods once and for all. They also couldn't neglect God's law. So Moses repeated those 10 commandments, which are the basis for God's moral law. In fact, the rest of Deuteronomy is actually just an amplification and an application of those same 10 commandments. Israel was to hear them, to learn them, to keep them, and to do them. And by obeying those laws, they would be honoring God and positioning themselves for victory and blessing. How many know that by obeying God's word, you're positioning yourself for victory and blessing? Now, it's also clear that the law, though, has to be in your heart if there's going to be true obedience. Us New Testament Christians, we need all these warnings that Moses gave them. We need them too. How prone are we to forget God's guidance and complain when circumstances get uncomfortable? You know, he has helped us in days gone by, and he's not going to forsake us now. We need to remember God's glory and greatness, for it's easy for idols to creep into our lives. TV, sporting events, cars, you name it, jobs. And we need to remind ourselves about God's goodness, how wonderfully that he's cared for us. If we love him and his word with all our hearts, then he will bless us and we will be a blessing to others. Now, Moses, he also warned these people of the potential pitfalls of the future. Remember, Israel had been a slave nation for centuries. Then for 40 years, they had been a pilgrim people. And now, what a blessing. They were going to settle into their own land. And they needed to be aware of the dangers that come along with being in this new environment. These were dangers that the people had to recognize, and they just had to avoid them. There was to be no compromise with the enemy. You know, it was God's purpose to drive the heathen nations, to drive them out, and to establish Israel in Canaan. But he had to warn Israel to utterly destroy these nations and to in no way compromise with them. Now, when God called Abraham to found this Jewish nation, he separated Abraham from the heathen around him. God promises to bless when his people are separated from sin. We live in a day when the church and the world sometimes seem to be so intermingled that sometimes it's difficult to tell who really belongs to Christ. Now, we've been called out of the world that we might be a testimony to those around us. So we have to know that being worldly as Christians only hinders the work of God. Listen. Now, they were also not to fear the enemy, because fear usually leads to compromise. We give in, thinking that we might protect ourselves against harm. Listen, Moses, he warned those people not to be afraid of the enemy, because God will be with Israel to give them the victory. Did he not deliver them from Egypt and from the kings in the wilderness? Then he would give them victory in Canaan. God would do the delivering, but it was the Israelites that were going to have to do the destroying. And they were going to have to eliminate the heathen kings and the idols and the altars. Anything, and I do mean anything, that remained would be a snare to them. And eventually, it was going to lead them into sin. Hey, brothers and sisters, listen, you got to stay with this thing. You got to keep reading the word. You got to keep checking us out on social media. And listen, you know what to do. Tell your friends. Tell your neighbors. FLCC, we're still on the move, brothers and sisters. We're taking ministry back to the first love. Peace.